Hello ladies and gentlemen, today we are back in War Thunder looking at another aircraft from the French tree. This is the VB.10C-1. It is the first of the VBs that you get in the game, as you can see here. It is the C1 and the other one is the O2. When we look at the armor on this machine, you're basically looking at some help for the pilot, 50mm on the front and back, which is actually pretty good to keep the pilot alive. But there is no other armor on the rest of the aircraft, which does, well, it definitely makes it struggle a little bit. So if we look at the X-ray, you may find something kind of interesting. We do have two engines in an inline system. So both of them are Hispano-Suiza 12 ZAR 15s, the 12-cylinder inline ones, and they both give out exactly the same amount of power. This is basically not the prototype version. This is the what was supposed to be the main production version of the machine. Unfortunately, it never flourished, but you know how it is. There is a ton of oil cooling and liquid cooling systems all over the place, which is always fun for pilots who want to destroy it. The wing spars are very small and can easily be destroyed. And then, of course, you have the offensive armament. So you have two 20mm Hispano 404s on each wing, totaling a ammunition count of 600, meaning that it's 150 per gun. You also have two fuel tanks in the center of the plane, and including these small ones, which are underneath the pilot as well. If we look at the plane itself, it is actually gigantic compared to other planes, and you'll see that in the gameplay part of this. But why not look at the modifications? So the modifications are very simple. There are no secondary armaments, unfortunately, for the VB.10C-1, so the only thing you have to really worry about is performance. Survivability is definitely something to consider, but I think performance is the first thing you should look at. Since the offensive 20mm are not a rank 1, modification, it might as well put it at the back of your mind and work on basically all of this before you move on to the offensive 20mm and the new 20mm cannons. They will give you a little bit more of stopping power, trying to kill stuff, but I think it's much more important getting yourself into a position where you can kill the enemy. So therefore, key upgrades, obviously engine injection, wings repair, but survivability does help a little bit, but maybe not as much as you might think. It is really sad to not see any secondary armaments on this machine, but I suppose it is how it is. It didn't have any in real life, so therefore it won't have any in-game. It is actually labelled as a heavy fighter, but it does get an airfield spawn, which is a bit of a sad thing, and also it does have a wonderful cockpit. But anyway, we're going to do some history, and then we'll get into some gameplay. I'll see you there. So in 1937, in January of that year, the French Air Ministry actually gave Arsenal de l'Aéronautique a contract to develop a twin-engine heavy interceptor. It was meant to be built from wood and powered by two 690 horsepower Hispano-Suiza 12X engines. Now, you may know Arsenal de l'Aéronautique. They are the people behind the VG series of aircraft. We have one present in game right now, and it is the VG-33. The engines were supposed to be mounted in tandem inside the fuselage, driving coaxial propellers in the nose. So basically very similar to what you see on the Wyvern in game. So through the course of several attempts and prototypes, they eventually created an all-aluminium VB-10 fighter. And the VB-10 design from 1937 was finally finished in 1938 by Michel Vernis and Robert Badie. And that's why the initials of their last names form VB. So very similar to VG when you have the head of Arsenal de l'Aéronautique and also the designer being the representatives of the VG. So the VB went through many iterations, but always had the same idea behind it. This idea of this two engines in tandem, and even the Germans tried to get involved on this idea. They definitely saw some potential in it. So before the prototype was built of the VB-10, there was a contract for 40 of the aircraft placed in May 1940. And the reason for this is basically because the French needed everything they could get. It seems like a lot of these contracts were not really binding at all, and they were just trying to get as much as they could in the air by the time of the invasion of France. Now, in June 1940, the construction and contract was suspended because of the capitulation of France. But then it was rebooted under the Vichy government, run by the RLM, which is, you're going to hate me, but I'm going to try it, the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, or the German Ministry of War. So in April 1942, they decided that they wanted to allow construction of a twin-engine propulsion system to see how well they could create one. I mean, remember, at this time, the Germans were thinking of stuff like the DO335. So therefore, they were very interested in these ideas. So to thoroughly evaluate the idea of this engine arrangement, the Germans actually made a plane by themselves. It's called the Latte Coer 299A, and it was basically a testbed for the engines of the Arsenal VB-10. And the 229A was powered by two 860 horsepower Hispano-Suiza 12Y V12s, and that is exactly the same as the first prototype of the VB-10, the VB.10C-1, which we do not have in game. But it's kind of interesting to think that there was a German aircraft which had these sets of engines just as a testbed. I mean, maybe it's a premium vehicle we see down the line. It didn't have any guns on it, and after being completed in July 1943, it was destroyed by an Allied bombing raid on the 30th of April 1944, so we only really have pictures of it, and that's about it. So, with the tide of the war changing, the French decided by themselves to create the first prototype of the VB-10. So this would be the VB-10C-1 in July 1944. It was an unarmed prototype which was powered by two 860 horsepower Hispano-Suiza 12Y31 12 cylinders, liquid-cooled engines, and had a nice sliding canopy with an obstructed rear view. So the aircraft was first flown on the 7th of July 1945 by a lad called Modeste Vonner, and during the initial flight, it was actually able to get up to 304 miles per hour or 490 kilometers an hour on the deck. Now, from this flight, an order for 200 of these aircraft was placed on the 22nd of December 1945, so pretty much, right on the end of the war, or just after. So the second prototype was then constructed. This is the VB-10C-2. It had a bubble canopy on it, which obviously gave better visibility, and was powered by two 1150 horsepower Hispano-Suiza 12Zs. The aircraft obviously had the 420mm Hispano-Suizas, and also the 650 cals. So this aircraft we actually do have in game. It is the second VB that you get in the tree. So obviously the minor changes. The engines are the same in game, because the one we actually have in game is the production version, not the first prototype. But yeah, basically different guns, different canopy. That's basically it. So the second prototype first flew on the 21st of September 1946, and unfortunately it had quite a lot of engine issues, including overheating and just general issues in the air that the pilot had to deal with, meaning that a lot of them, or a lot of the time in the air, was struggling with trying to keep the engines going instead of flying the plane. And because of this, the initial order of 200 was dropped to 50, basically because, the efficiency of the machine was just not seen to be great. And also jets were coming along at this time, meaning that a plane like this would become pretty much obsolete. So the first production VB-10 actually made its first flight on the 3rd of November 1947. The aircraft had two Hispano-Suiza 12Z15/16 engines, and they're rated at 1300 horsepower max, but one 1150 horsepower continuous. It was also armed with the 420mm, but it didn't have the second prototype 50 cals, and that's basically the one that I'm talking about now. So the first one that we have in game, the C1, is the first production version of this plane. What is kind of interesting is it could also carry bombs. It could carry one 500 kilo on each of the wings, totaling 1,000 kilos or 2,200 pounds of bombs. And also it had additional fuel which could be placed where the machine guns were not. It's kind of weird how we don't have this option in game. I'm sure either in the future or something we will see it. Now, the big improvements from this aircraft from the prototypes was the fact it was a hell of a lot faster. So on the ground, it was 323 miles per hour, and at 25,000 foot, or 7,500 meters, it was able to get up to 435. So the performance was a lot better on the production variant. Unfortunately, for the VB-10 series of aircraft, the beginning of the end was on the 10th of January 1948. So the second prototype, which had the 50 cals, the VB-10C-1, it caught fire over Paris. And an uncommanded propeller pitch change over-revved the rear engine, which destroyed the engine, basically ripping it apart, and it started setting on fire. So there was nothing the pilot could do, who was Pierre Decroux at the time, and he had to leave the aircraft, which basically meant that the aircraft was done for, being unmanned and on fire. He also unfortunately suffered decent burns, which is very unfortunate. And because of this, obviously at the time, since they had a reduced order of only 50 instead of 200, and also, as I said, jets coming along, they were more dubious about the VB series. But then, on a third occasion, so on the 15th of September 1948, the third production machine crashed in a very similar fashion to the VB-10C-2. So the back engine ripping itself apart, setting on fire, and unfortunately this time it killed the pilot. His name was Henry Koechlin, and unfortunately he didn't survive. 6 days later, on the 21st of September 1948, the whole contract in itself was cancelled. So this basically meant the end of the VB-10 aircraft. There was only 4 of them ever officially made, discluding the prototypes. So overall, you have about 6 aircraft in total. You have 4 productions, 2 prototypes, and also some additional airframes were completed, and that's really about it. It's very sad how this aircraft came about, but it is kind of interesting to think if they were able to create it at the start of the war, would it have been able to change anything? I highly doubt it, especially with its engine issues. But also, it does mean that there is an opportunity in the game to have a much lower tier one, which had less power and maybe less guns on it in the form of the VB-10C-1. Obviously, the VB-10C-1 didn't have guns on it, but, you know, some things can be changed. I mean, the Horton exists in the game, which is pretty much a conglomeration of 3 separate Hortons, basically picking the best bits. So why not? The French need everything they can get. But that's pretty much the history of the VB. It's really unfortunate, just like a lot of these French planes, which could have seen some use in 1940 and 1941, but didn't. Let's get into some gameplay. So with the VB, it puts me in an interesting place in my mind. While grinding through this thing, the stock version of the VB is pretty bad, to be honest. One of the things that this massive plane really struggles with is speed. But once you start getting the engine upgrade, once you start getting the engine injection, the cover, and all of those things, it actually becomes a pretty decent heavy fighter. And it exists in this space, which is kind of interesting to me. So on one end of the spectrum, you have all of the normal fighters. So you have stuff like the C-202, C-205, BF-109, Spitfire, P-51, or P-47, and then on the other end, you have stuff like the Beaufighter, HE-219, and the VB. Because the VB, in all intents and purposes, is a heavy fighter. But I think it's one of the best heavy fighters out there. Now, the reason I say this is because once you get all of the upgrades, basically what you're left with is a fighter which is very happily sat around 500 to 600 kilometers an hour, is the first French aircraft I've run into which actually handles well at speed. It turns exceptionally well for such a large aircraft, and generally can go toe-to-toe with some of the meme machines that it will run into at its BR, if it's at speed. And this is where we get into the interesting part, because obviously the meta of the game is very much dominated by aircraft which are fast, agile, nippy, and have an ability to be able to gain energy and keep it for a long time, basically diving on an enemy at the end, making sure that they're dead, being able to recoup, do it to the next guy. The VB can do that, but because it is so heavy, and because it doesn't have as much engine power as, or, power to weight ratio, I should say, compared to some of those smaller fighters, it does their job, but slightly worse. And this is where the conundrum comes in. So if you're talking about a heavy fighter, pound for pound, I think the only one which actually stands up to this is the 219. You could throw in the B6R3 into that category as well, but it is at 5.3, whereas the VB is at 4.3. So the 219 is its only real competition. If you compare it to any other heavy fighter around its BR, it will absolutely decimate it, just because it has the maneuverability at high speeds, it has the roll rate, and it has a decent enough climb once it's fully upgraded to be able to compete with them. The issue is that isn't the meta, and the meta dictates generally what does well. So because you have no secondary armaments on the VB, that basically means that you are in a fighter role. And because you're in a heavy fighter role, you may think, well, it's my job to go after bombers. Going after bombers in this, generally you go up against BVs or DOs. Now, facing DOs is completely fine. Against BVs, you run into a few issues. The reasons for this is because, well, the VB is a massive aircraft. It's very easy to hit from a whiles away. It doesn't have any armor on its wings or near its engines, so therefore taking out the engines is easy to do. What you'll also find is on head-on engagements in the VB, it's very bad at them. First of all, it has the guns on the wings, so convergence is an issue, and also your wings generally get snapped off very easily, meaning that, there's no armor on them, it's easy to snap them. So if you're chasing a bomber and he's got his turrets going at you, then yeah, you're gonna lose a wing incredibly quickly. Now when we talk about the guns, the Hispano 404s have never had an issue doing damage. The issue has always been ammunition with them. We look at the D520, the MB157 for examples. The VB has 600 rounds and 4 Hispanos. This means if you're able to use any belt, preferably stealth or universal, or even default if you feel like it, and you're able to get guns on target, you're going to absolutely annihilate the enemy. And because this plane is large, but has decent maneuverability for such a large plane, you are able to do that in a lot more scenarios than you would in any other heavy fighter in the game. But it's still kind of fragile. When we talk about diving, it can dive up to 800 kilometers an hour, which is very useful. Something that it does have an issue with, which you may see there, is if you pull the elevator up, it has a very responsive elevator, but if you actually push down on it, it really doesn't do a lot for you. The combat flaps can be popped around about 450 kilometers an hour, which once again is incredibly useful for you, and they also come out very slowly, meaning that at higher speeds you can use them slightly and then pull them back up. But this is not a fighter to get hits. Heavy fighters in general have this general capacity that they can take hits. The A-26, brilliant example of this. Something that can tank shots because of its armor. The VB is not this aircraft. The best way to fly it is to fly it like you would a normal fighter, but understand that you don't have the climb rate of a normal fighter. This means you have to stay in a supportive role, you have to wait for the enemies to dive, and then you have to use your altitude and eventually your superior speed to go after them. Something that is interesting, if you keep the engines above around 500 kilometers an hour, you will generally be able to keep them cool with war emergency power running, and if you can't, it doesn't really matter. 100% on both of these engines, you're generally going to be able to run down anything. And also, at altitude, it does perform exceptionally well. I've had a hell of lots of fun in this aircraft. It has been kind of annoying sometimes, just because, as I said, a lot of these single-engine fighters, they can turn better than you. Sometimes they can keep up in the dive with you, and also, one of the biggest issues is that stock grind. The stock grind is horrible in the VB, and with a lot of fighters like it, it's very similar. The Tempest comes to mind, or anything like the Bearcat. As once you get those upgrades, you start thinking, oh, this might be a comparable fighter. But before you do, it feels absolutely awful to fly, because it just feels like a heavy mess. And that is the way I would describe the VB until you get it fully upgraded, and then it becomes an actually fun aircraft to fly. Also, as a little tidbit, you can open the cockpit, and it does have a very nice cockpit, and at the same time, let's say your back engine gets killed, but the front engine does. The front prop, which is linked to the back engine, I know it's a bit odd, but that's how it works, will actually stop turning, whereas the other one will keep turning. So that's a nice little thing that they've added in there. Same with the front engine. If you knock out the front engine, then the back prop will get knocked out. But overall, for a heavy fighter, I've been impressed. Now, that doesn't mean a lot, because around this BR you have some really nice, we'll say, lighter fighters, or interceptors, which have, you know, just better roll rates, better turns, better everything. But overall, it's still nice to fly something in the French tree, which I feel is fun to fly. Apart from, you know, well, basically everything else is not fun to fly in my opinion. This is the first French aircraft I've had fun in, apart from the VG-33. But anyway, thanks for watching.